good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. It's brilliant to be joined by both Jackie and Justin to talk today about the progress that we've made around specifically gender equality and equality more broadly, and specifically to speak on the topic of intersectionality. Excited to have the discussion and to be joined by Jackie and Justin. So my first question to you both, happy for one of you to take the lead on this. What progress have we made in the last 5 years around the topic of gender equality globally? And what successes can we point to, and where do we think we need to make further progress? Jackie, would you like to begin?
Sure. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jackie Glenn, and I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. And, as a Black woman, I and someone who have done the work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for over 25 years, yes, progress has been made, Johanna, but as far as Black women and African and American women are concerned, the progress that have been made has not been enough for us. And so I think if you ask me what progress have been made, I would say that we're talking about it more. But it has become, it's something that companies can't shy away from. We're talking about women in because you always find that you can find women in different companies, just where are they located in the company? Are they in the C-suite or in the upper echelon of the company, or are they mid-level manager? And the progress that would make me happy, and I think a lot of women like myself, is to see us in the upper C-suite of different companies and on public and private boards. I think more needs to be done, but the fact that it's so publicized now and we're talking about it, I think I can only point as that being progress. I think a lot, women of color are even further behind than women overall, because if you think about it, Johanna, the people that are running companies are white male, most of them. Mm-hmm. And their natural flock is to tap a white woman that looks like you. And so women of color still suffer at a greater rate in terms of progress. Mm-hmm. And I hope that if anyone is on here listening, they'll understand the whole notion of sameness. And that, when I go in with you, Joanna, and we both have, for all intents and purposes, the same qualification, and someone who is white is interviewing, they might just go with you because they're more comfortable. Yeah. And so we have to look at all the difference. The conference is about intersectionality, but we also can't not talk about sameness and how comfortable people get with having people. We all do sameness, but sometimes we have to remember that diversity drives innovation. And if you have a diverse group of people on your team will thrive and innovate much faster. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Justin.
Thanks, Jackie. So I think on the question of gender equality, has progress been made? Or I think we have seen a fair amount of progress over the last 5 years, right? So you just look at the data, say from the 30% club, and you see that on boards, and it's UK data, but actually it does, they did a global analysis. You've seen women on boards increase threefold from 10% to around 30%. There's still clearly a lot of work to be done, particularly around retention and I think the feeling of belonging in our organisations. So I think where progress does need to be made, it follows on from what Jackie said, is around the intersectionality. When I speak to LGBT women, when I speak to women of colour, when I speak to women who maybe come from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's clear that they feel the gender movement that we've seen has actually left, or may have left them behind, and benefited people only of certain backgrounds and of certain status. So I do think there's plenty more work to be done in order to create a true level playing field for all. But the one thing the gender movement has done, which I think has been a real positive, and the gender movement has been more global, that it has provided a platform for other movements to actually take place. And I think that is really important. That is really important. So whilst it may not have spread into those other areas as of yet, the platform and the foundations that the gender movement has established has allowed, I think, easier passage for other minority and marginalised groups.
Thanks, Justin. A really important point there, and I would agree with that. With both of those comments, I think that there is definitely data to show that we have made progress, but that progress, I think, is quite based on, primarily white women. I think the point of intersectionality is what we're really going to explore through this conversation as a really important one, but it has started to help us have conversations on the topic of gender equality, and more broadly, as you're mentioning there, just in other areas. I think it's, as you were talking there, Jackie, really important point, and one that I'm interested in is progress around white feminism and the notion of white feminism, and has that driven wrong behaviours that we're seeing in organisation? Has that meant that we are, to your point, Justin, it's not just about having women in the top table, it's about them making sure that those voices are heard, they're feeling included when they are on the top table. And if the progress isn't considering all women, actually does that have a negative impact on both those women that are at the top table? So it brings me on to my next question, which is, what are the dangers of talking about equality with focusing on intersectionality? To your point, Justin, women from the LGBT community, Black, brown women, women that may have disabilities, come from disadvantaged backgrounds. What's the danger if we're not focusing on the breadth and intersectionality?
Shall I go? Yeah. No, I can take that question. So I think the danger is certain groups get left behind, right? The way I mentioned before, and I do worry that by focusing on narrow focus can lead to other problems further down the line. So I think that needs to come out. But I think we have to realise why we're doing this in the first place, and the why we're doing it in the first place is that surface level diversity and having people of different backgrounds is really a key input, a key indicator to me to improve cognitive diversity. Mm-hmm. And you've seen all the studies, right? That having a mixed gender team, it improves financial results. Having a multi-ethnicity team creates better results. But I think that we have to understand cause and effect, right? Actually, what you need is an inclusive culture. That's the important thing. And then that leads to a wider representation across the board. What you can't do is have a horrible culture and just throw blunt instruments at it and think that will change. So I think having people of different backgrounds, having people of different cultures, different experiences, really gets you to that diversity of thought. And I think discussing one source of equality over another actually becomes counterproductive. And actually what we need to think about is cognitive diversity as a whole. And if you think about that as a whole, that's when you start to think, incorporate different backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Justin. Jackie?
So, I think this is such a great pairing because, I, of course, come at it, although most of my life I spent in a global role, but I do live in the US and I'm originally from Jamaica, but I've spent my entire adult life in the US. And so most of the things that I'm discussing here today is framed from my work in the US and a US lens. And so when I think about the danger of not looking at everyone intersectionality, the danger is vast, because I always say this, Johanna, that people don't know me. I open my mouth, they see me, and they don't know all of the intersectionality that comes with me. And so I think as Justin said, it really can be problematic if people don't know you and they assume things about you. So as I work with different organizations, one thing that I always bring to the table is that although we in the US are right now in the midst of a serious racial unrest and just racial injustice and prejudice, when I go into an organization, I always bring with me that iceberg slide. And if any of you are practitioners on this call or in the audience, you'll know what slide I'm talking about. That iceberg slide talks about the different dimensions of diversity. And if you are centering your conversations around all the dimensions of diversity, around race, around gender, and I know we're talking with a lens on gender, because gender and disability is something that transcends globally. And so clearly it's a good one to talk about today. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up that iceberg slide, because I think in order for us to make sure that we're intersecting everyone and everyone is in stations entering into the conversation, we have to keep the iceberg slide in mind so it doesn't become dangerous that we're not looking at people's intersectionality. Something that I do, Johanna, when I go into companies is ask people to focus on who they are as an individual and draw an intersectionality map. I made that one up. So don't Google it, you might not be able to find it. But basically, an intersectionality map is you in the middle and who you are. So mine is Jackie Glenn. I'm an immigrant. I'm a mom. I'm a grandma. I have a disability. I'm married. I'm a Christian. And there's so much about me. I'm a technology executive. And I can go on. I'm a business owner, and on and on and on. And so when people see me, they don't just look at me and see all those intersectionality. And I think the way you can get beyond leaving people out is by focusing on that iceberg slide. So when I go into an organization, I say to them, today WebEx is going to be focused a lot on race, but it's not lost on me all of the dimensions of diversity. And as I continue to work with you as an organization, we will cover all of the dimensions of diversity. And so that sets the tone up. So if someone is listening to me, they don't think all I come to the table with is race and gender, but there is LGBTQA, there's disability, there's religion, or some people call it their interfaith. There is, as Justin said, diversity of thinking, there's geographic diversity, there's generational diversity. There's a lot of different dimensions of diversity. And as practitioners, we all need to understand that and weave that into every and anything we do.
It's a really good point, actually. I think that intersectionality map, which is a really good phrase, actually, which I might have to use that.
I'm just going to charge you a small fee.
Yeah, so I think that really, it symbolizes your identity, right? And this is the key to helping people feel like they belong in organizations, is that their identity is respected. Mm-hmm. And I think the big challenge is if elements of your identity aren't respected or ignored, I think that's when you feel like you don't belong in an organization. That's when you don't feel included.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. It definitely is. And a lot of times people make assumption. I was teaching a class yesterday on bias, Justin, and I was telling people that, the stereotyping, you walk into a room or you get into an elevator as a Black man, and the first thing that comes to mind, especially if you have a hoodie on, white woman starts clutching their pocketbook. And I don't mean to pick on my white girlfriends, but it happens so much in the US, or they cross over to the next side of the road. And that's stereotyping. And so there's so much bias, and it doesn't mean that they're bad, but they've listened to all that hype on TV and on the television that they stereotype us. And that's why it's so important for us to know who we are, and really at walking to any organization with this old notion of, I am just not what you're looking at. There's more to me than what you see. There's more beneath the eye, as my mom liked to say.
Yeah. And as you've both pointed out, so many of those aspects of our identity are invisible. They're invisible to the human eye. And whilst we often focus a lot more of the conversation on the things that are visible, but where we're from, a lot of disabilities, these things they're invisible. You touched on something that I wanted to ask an additional question on there, Jackie, is around assumptions. And I absolutely agree. We see it all the time, people making assumptions about someone before having all of the information, as you said, the intersectionality map. I also really like that phrase. What advice would you give to anyone, not just leaders, any employee in an organisation, in terms of a practical step of how they don't do that? How do you stop making those assumptions before you understand who someone really is, without having a session, but day to day? What are the things that people can really think about to prevent them doing that and making those assumptions?
So there's a saying that goes, bias is like the air we breathe, and we all come to the table with biases. All of us have biases. And so it's how do we mitigate and manage our bias? And so the advice I would have is just, I always tell people that I'm going to treat you the way I'd like you to treat me. And so I go into every relationship assuming positive intent, assuming not that, what I might have read about a certain type of people, but just assuming positive intent because I want the same. And so I assume positive intent. I ask everyone to do it. And I try to sort of put away the stereotype that I might have been raised with or born with. And I'll give you a quick example. I was working years ago when I just started as a chief diversity officer. I was working with a Harvard professor here in Boston by the name of Dr. Charles Ogletree. I think he's world renowned. He was the the professor for Michelle and Barack Obama, the former first lady and president. And he said to me, Jackie, you know what you need to do? Because we all have bias, you need to identify what is your bias. And so if you're listening, any individual, what are some of the things that you're prone to sort of kind of make snap judgment on? And for me, that was education. I was born and raised in the Caribbean. My mom always taught me and drove in me that knowledge is power. And then I end up in HR, and my first job was a recruiter. And so whenever I got a resume, if it didn't have a degree on it, I would not call the person in. And he called me out on that, and he said, that's a bias. And so one of the trick I use now is when I get a resume, I ask my assistant to scratch out the address and the educational background. I don't want to see, put a Sharpie through it and use a black one so I can't peek. And I base my selection solely, Justin, on the person background and experience and what they bring to the job. And almost 70 or more % of the time, I pick someone who probably didn't finish their degree because of circumstances beyond their control. But it really worked for me, suspending my judgment and going in with just an open, assuming positive intent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important that I like that, assuming positive intent. And often people become very defensive when we talk about biases, and often people think they don't have biases, which is impossible. We are human beings. And so, you know, the psychology around this is that in order to make the hundreds of decisions we have to each week, we couldn't physically function as human beings without. They often serve a positive purpose, but they often then play out in a negative way as well. And so trying to be as aware of those as possible, but also asking others that will give you very honest feedback about what biases they think that you have is often one of the other really helpful ways of trying to break down some of those assumptions that we often have. I wanted to talk specifically around intersectionality, but why does this play, and you touched on this right at the start, Jackie, the progress that we've made for gender equality primarily has benefited white women. What are the particular issues, what are the particular challenges or things that could be done differently that could support gender equality for non-white women? Jackie.
Justin, you want me to take that one? I wanted to hear what Justin had to say.
Let's go with Justin first.
Brother, I'd like me first. Get your input.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I actually got into a debate on well, I had a comment on one of my posts on LinkedIn stressing that that how gender was more important than ethnicity. Because you know there's more people, or there's more women in the potential universe that can go into the workplace than ethnic minorities, and I was kind of scratching my head a little bit and thinking, well, first of all, having that debate is very counterproductive because it's not one or the other, and it kind of makes me despair a little bit. But you were right. You know, when you look at the data, it shows that we haven't really seen progression in let's say board diversity over the last 10 years the way you've seen on the gender side. So what can we do about it? I think ultimately I think there's two key things for me which would make a significant difference out of all the interventions, is really trying to understand people's lived experience. In the UK, we've got this term called BAME, which I think includes Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. I think that in itself as a phrase is challenging, or should be challenged. And actually what you really need to do is break down the different lived experience for different ethnicities to really understand what people are going through in your organization. But it's not only listening, it's also actually having people in your organization that have that lived experience to actually drive policy. Because what you tend to find is that people come up with, they listen in one area, then the people who are creating the policies are actually in an ivory tower, and there's actually no input from those minorities who they are trying to, what they're trying to address. I think that is vitally important, that disconnect. I think the second thing is really looking at your overall culture, and it comes back to the education point which Jackie was mentioning. I think that there is a huge challenge in a number of our workplaces where people believe that being colorblind is the right way. I don't recognize color. I don't believe there's, I don't see color. But actually, if you are not recognizing people's color, are you ignoring their identity? Are you ignoring their lived experience? Are you fully appreciating their overall identity? So I do think it's important to be, and it's a phrase which one of these TED Talks that I watched, color brave. Actually, in order to be a true ally, a true advocate, you have to be able to, you have to help to break down those structural barriers.
Yeah.
So I think there are two things I'd say. I'd say, you know, be color brave rather than color blind, and also not only listen to people's lived experience, but actually have those marginalized people help in actually developing your policy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that point there that we don't see color. I've had many a debate when anyone has termed that phrase. We see gender, we see, of course, and I also think, and for many white people, and I've had again quite heated discussions on this topic, to even be afraid to say that, as you're describing there, Justin, the experiences of a Black man or woman are different to the experiences of an Asian man or woman. How people have immigrated into the UK and the history around slavery means that there are significant differences. And I think that point around understanding people's lived experiences and the differences and being inquisitive. I do a lot of work in the education sector and working with children, and children have the beautiful ability of being inquisitive and asking questions. And we seem to lose that in adulthood, and people seem to be afraid of asking difficult questions or having a conversation. And someone even said to me, about 12 months ago, I was doing an article and I was talking about the experiences of Black women. And he said to me, you can't use the term Black, you can't, that's offensive to people. And I was kind of very taken back and tried to really understand why he thought that. And so again, being brave, as you're saying, of having conversations with people and really understanding their experiences. And just kind of adding, as a white woman, I think white people need to feel uncomfortable in these conversations as well. Jackie, you said that very at the start, and it's the one phrase I keep continuing to say to others. We've got to feel uncomfortable if we want to start seeing some change in this area.
One of the things that I have done, globally since the murder of George Floyd, is really insist when clients or prospective clients call me, and I'm going to dive right into your question, is really insist on, helping them to think through, why are you calling me? And if you are calling me, because everyone is so polarized right now. And so you're so right. People don't even want to say the word Black. And so in my course that Johanna, you and I had spoken about, Courageous Conversation, the depolarization of the workforce, it's so important that people get to a point where they can live, as Justin says, think about people lived experience. And instead of asking people, women and people of color, as we call them, Justin, in the US, people of color, and that's anyone who's not white, instead of sitting them down and say, Jackie, tell me about your lived experience, a lot of organizations are asking their Black and brown employee to drive their diversity effort. And it's dangerous because these people are already traumatized with everything that's going on in the world. And now you want them to come into the organization, do their other job, and then do this side job of educating you on all of the dimensions of diversity. And so when in answering to your question, what can we do, Joanna? I think that, Justin touched on it around allyship. One of the reasons being in corporate America, as long as I had, when I left corporate America 2 years ago, the first thing I did, because I didn't want to forget, was write a book called Lift as I Climb, An Immigrant Girl's Journey Through Corporate America. Shameless plug, you can get it on Amazon on my website. But this book talks about how do you give back, how do you lift people up, how do you live and learn? And I didn't want people to see me as a former corporate executive and said, oh, she had it easy. I want them to understand what the tools I use and the journey I took to get to the level I got to in corporate America. And when I was there, Joanna, one of the things that I didn't see happen a lot is people lifting each other, especially women. So when you talk about intersectionality with a focus on women, I have to get a little heated because I really talked about the fact that white women like yourself, they get to a spot, but they don't look back. And if they do look back, they only lift other white women, but they don't remember the Black and brown sisters that are out there. And I think it's important, Joanna, for people to understand that, you know, if they really want to help and do something, they have to lift. And you can't be in a room talking about equality and diversity, and the room is filled with all white women, because we're doing exactly what we're talking about the white guys are doing. We are excluding a huge portion of women. So when I go into organization and they say to me, oh, we have a lot of diversity here, and I said, speak more to that. It's usually always gender. And when I dig a little bit more, it's always women, and they're always white. And I said, do you have anyone that looks like me? And I usually get you could hear a pin drop, because the answer is usually no, but they don't want to tell me no. And so they really have to look within the gender piece and make sure that they're included all women. And I always say all women. If we're going to do the gender piece, make sure it's all women. And it goes back to what Justin said around the debate he have. Is it ethnicity or is it gender? And I think the problem why it's such a debate, while we know that there's a larger portion of women in the workforce, but if you peel back the onion and look at it, it's mostly white women at the upper echelons of the company. And so I would argue, Justin, that, you know, if they want to only talk about women, they have to make a level playing field that women like myself and my daughters and all the other Black and brown women that are out there get a chance, just like our white sisters.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I just had one thing on allyship. I think allyship has turned into this noun or identity, but actually allyship to me is a verb. You know, you have to do something. You have to actually, you know, try to break down those barriers. So I do think that the whole concept of being an ally, I think, you know, needs to be redefined, because unless you're doing something, are you truly an ally?
It's that thing.
I just did a course. I'm so glad you said that, Justin. We really make a good team, because I just did a course on allyship. And the first slide I had up was allyship is a verb, because you cannot be a self-appointed ally. And so I discuss the different types of ally. There's a cheerleader, there's the amplifier, there's the researcher, there's the intervener, and there's a supporter. And so you have to decide which one, but all of those are not just saying something, it's doing something. You're cheering, you're encouraging, you're amplifying. Okay, I like what Jackie said, so I'm gonna amplify it. And so I so love that you talk about it being a verb, because a lot of people have come and said, what can I do? And I said, you can be an ally, but it's a verb. You can't just say you are and wear a t-shirt with the word ally on it and you do nothing. You have to do something. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah. And to add to that, you have to do something, and that has to be consistent as well. I've seen lots of statements, lots of, as you're saying there, Justin, people saying they're an ally. Actually, I don't think anyone should be saying, I think others should be saying this person is an ally because of all of these things that they're doing, and that it needs to be, I think it has to be consistent. It's not just doing one thing and feeling that's enough. And I kind of absolutely agree with the points made there, and explored some of the reasons or some of the challenges of things that organisations could be doing. I wanted to ask both of you if you've got any organisations that you could point to, or particular group industries that we could point to that are actually making some really good progress in the area of intersectionality, and as we're saying, not just focusing their inclusion strategies only on gender, but really looking at intersectionality. Have either of you got any examples you could share?
Oh, I have to really think about that, because I can't think of any organization that are doing, organization are doing, that I can think of are doing a variety of stuff and not just a deep focus on just intersectionality. But I'll point one out, and this is not a global organization, so I'm sorry, but there's an organization in Boston that's called the Partnership, and they really focus on, making sure they bring all diverse, mid-level to senior level executives together. And they started this organization, the Partnership, because in Boston, they were educating a lot of people of color, and they would leave Boston and go somewhere else and get a job. And so now what they're doing, and they've been doing this for almost, I want to say 30 years, is making sure they have a forum where these individuals can come and get developed, can form networks, and they're constantly being developed on things of, what do you do if you're the only Black executive or brown executive in your company? How do you show up? What are some of the tools and tips? And we provide them with coaches. And I think that they're doing a good job, but they're focusing on all of the dimensions of diversity with a bigger focus on people of color.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. I suppose the only, I can't think of a company. But in terms of organisations, there's an organisation that I'm involved in that Johanna, is the Diversity Project.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that they have done some fantastic things in the asset management industry and beyond, really thinking about what, beyond gender. And the way they do that is essentially they've got the different groups, so ethnicity, gender, LGBT, but then they've got this, the board on top, which just tries to pull it all together. And I think why they're doing a great job is you do get that crossover between the different groups because you've got that top level. But actually, I think the reason why I mention them in particular is because there's a recognition there that an individual company can't really solve these huge societal issues. And actually, it's only when we come together collaboratively that we're actually going to be able to have enough resource and have enough bandwidth to actually focus on what is quite, complex, multi-dimensional kind of challenge. So I think that is really important, and I think the industries that have done that are the industries that will actually make the significant change.
Excellent point there, Justin. I entirely agree that a single organisation isn't going to be able to do this alone. And actually there is huge benefit of organisations collaborating and coming together, because this is about opening up a wider talent pool. This is about creating more opportunities for all people within an industry. And we know talent needs to move from company to company. That's part of how organisations grow and develop. And I think that there is some interesting work in particular sectors where organisations are actually coming together, competitors are coming together. We're doing a piece of work at the moment with a few in the finance sector and looking at something like social mobility as an example collectively, and I think we'll make quicker and greater progress taking that approach than every organisation thinking that they have to come up with the solution as a single organisation.
Yeah.
My next question is around the difference of equity and equality. And this is something that Jackie, you and I discussed previously. First of all, my first question is what is the difference? And then my second is, should organisations be adopting equity strategies?
Yeah.
Can I go first, Jackie? Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Yes, I think they should adopt it, but they, like everything else, there has to be a clear, rationale around, okay, why are we adopting equity strategy, and how is this going to be rolled out, and what will be the process around it? Because I think a lot of times, especially now, I find that companies are running to adopt a whole lot of things and to say they have it. And I would just caution that, yes, equity and equality. So when I think of it, if your first question is, are they the same? And, when I think of equity, I think of a situation being in corporate America and really finding out that I was paid significantly less than my counterpart direct reports. So not even my counterpart, but their direct report. It's in my book, so it's no secret. And so that I felt was both an equity issue, but also an equality issue. And so I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I feel like, I don't have the Webster dictionary in front of me, but I think they can, people can say, Jackie, I treat you equitably, I bring you into everything, but I treat you equal. And I want to say it could be looked at as one and the same. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to figure out, how do I call it out? Maybe Justin has a different take on it from me, but I feel like, one of the reasons why people when I started diversity and started in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was just D&I, diversity and inclusion. The last couple of years, they've added equity and belonging to it. And so now I talk a lot about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because what I realized that you will get a diverse candidate in an organization, you'll interview them, they'll get in there, and they feel like they're not being treated equitably. Mm-hmm. And they're not brought in, they're not paid fairly, they're not brought to the table, and they don't feel like they belong. And is being treated equitably or being included or equally, I feel like it's the same in a sense. And a lot of people left that looks like me. And every time we interview them on their exit interview, the word equity and equality came up. Mm-hmm. Every time. And now as I go around to different organizations and interview and do listening tours around diversity, that word is always front and center. And they usually come, it's either or. I'm not being treated equitably. I'm not being included. So I feel like in a way they could be one and the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah. No.
I think disagree with me. I was gonna say.
I disagree with you. No. I suppose the way I look at this is, and I'll talk about belonging first. So ultimately, when you first join an organization, there is a level of adaptation for everybody. Everybody has to try and adapt to a particular culture. The more different you are, the more gap there is between your culture and their culture, the bigger the adjustment factor. And I think that in itself leads to, people feeling that they don't belong. I'll come back onto that in a second. So when I then think about equity and equality, I think they are similar in that they both have, the foundation of both is fairness, right? The foundation they're both built on is fairness. Mm-hmm. But when I think of equality, it's treating everybody equally. When I think of equity, it's treating people on basis of need and maybe background and maybe culture and difference. And I just give you a few examples, and maybe these are very, very terrible examples, but they're examples that at least I can relate to. So we used to do this when I was at one of my organizations. We used to do this bus. It was called a sandwich run, because we're global. I was going to call it a butty run, but no one would understand what I'm talking about, right? So sandwich run, and in the morning on the Friday morning, and there'd be, typically it would be bacon sandwiches or sausage sandwiches. And you just think about there, if like now, one thing that would be going through my head is, do we have vegetarians in the team? Do we have vegans in the team? Do we have Muslims in the team? Do we have, Jewish people in the team? So I think you can buying everybody a bacon bussy is treating them equally, right? But actually, you're not really understanding the difference there. Another example is socials. I mean, socials are a big challenge to a lot of people who feel they don't belong, right? So for example, going to the pub or going to a bar for a drink after work with your colleagues, actually, for some people who have childcare, some people who don't drink, again, you might be treating everybody equally by saying everybody come, but actually you're excluding people. So I think thinking about it like that, I would say that equity is trying to address those different needs of different people to make them or help them to feel included within your organization, help them to feel like they belong.
Let me chime in that a mentee of mine, I love my peeps, is watching me, and she sent me a note, and she said, in her view, before you can get to equality, you have to address the inequities that exist and develop intentional strategy to ensure that people, so you have to put stuff in place, intentional strategy that people have the same opportunity. And I gave the example earlier on, that's my mentee, you know who you are, of me being paid below my peers' direct report. And I can't even quote the amount because you'll fall off your chair. And when I found that out, everybody acts as if it was incorrect until they check it. But this is such a good, before you can arrive, get equality, you have to address the inequities that are out there. There's a lot of inequities out there. And so thank you so much for that thought. But absolutely.
That's a really good way.
Yeah, your point about addressing people going out. When I first got into corporate America, it was a lot of guys, and every night they wanted to go to the bar, and I had young kids, and so I got dinged a little bit because I wasn't in the inner circle. So I wouldn't think that I was being treated equitably. And so I think people just have to look to see how they treat everyone, and are you just golfing, or are you doing other things so everyone can take part, just like your sandwich examples, Justin.
Thank you both, and thank you for your mentee, Jackie, in the audience. I really like that, addressing the inequities before we can achieve equality. I absolutely agree, and Justin, very helpful examples as well. And I think sometimes we don't think enough about equity to understand, as your mentee said, how we do achieve equality. I'd like to ask one final question because I can see we've got a few questions from the audience, and it's about individual responsibility. Often when we're talking about topics around diversity, inclusion, equity, we focus on the responsibility of leaders, the responsibility of corporates, the responsibility of society as a whole. As individuals, what one piece of advice, what one thing could people be doing to help us make sure that we focus on intersectionality and not just single topics of diversity? As individuals, what could we each be doing? Justin, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think we've covered this, but I think that one of the big challenges of being in an organization, being in a large society, is that it's very easy to pass the buck on to somebody else. So, it's the organization that has to change. It's the CEO, it has to come from the top down. It has to come from our line manager. But actually, we're all part of our organizations. We're all part of society. We're actually inputs into that, right? So I think we have to realize our individual responsibility. I think the one thing that I would like to see is it is actually, and it was, I think Jackie mentioned it in one of her allyship points. I think being a supporter is really important, because the onus shouldn't be on the person who's being marginalized, let's say by microaggressions, to educate people. And again, Jackie mentioned this. Actually, I would really like for the allies to help to speak up and help to educate people as well. I think that's really important, because when you start to have that, then it stops being a gender problem or a Black problem or an LGBT problem, and it becomes everybody's problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. As I think through that question, what comes to mind is an article I did in Business Insider. I believe that we all have the responsibility to not stay silent. Silence, I know this is harsh, is violence. Silence is complicit. Silence is agreement. And I know you're gonna say to me, if you're listening to me, that Jackie, I don't know what to say, but there's a lot of things that you could say. You can approach the conversation with empathy. And there's a saying in empathy, and I spoke about empathy in my book, but I saw this definition, I use it a lot, that empathy only requires, Johanna, that you step outside of your own self and view the individual you're talking to perspective without any type of, just step outside and listen. And so I think the big thing that I can say is that people have got to not stay silent. And I think all that has been going on in the world right now, everyone is talking, and I personally hope it doesn't go away, because silence is complicit. Silence is agreement. And people have said, Jackie, I don't know if I actually agree with that, but I feel like you don't have to get a bullhorn and stand on a bus in London or in Boston and scream, but there are other things you can do. And so if I was to give you one thing, don't stay silent. It's not going away. People refuse to be treated unfairly anymore, and people are standing up. And so don't stay silent.
Thank you both. Great advice there, and absolutely on the silence point. And I think to add to that one, Jackie, as well, we can all not stay silent in different ways. I was having a conversation earlier this week, and someone says, I find it very difficult. I'm not a confrontational person. I don't like I'm a real introvert, and so spent a long time saying, actually, you can speak up, but you can do it in a way that's authentic to who you are, and still that it allows you not to stay silent. And I think that's really important as well. We've got a few questions, and I'd just like to cover a couple of them. The first one from Kathy. My company has a huge culture of recruiting from our own network, but we have a leadership team that is largely male, all white, and all with high levels of education. So our intersectional diversity, especially at senior levels, is terrible. Any tips on how we can change?
Go first. Yeah, you go, Jackie, first.
I'll go first and say, coming out of the technology industry sounds like where I was before, not to out my company, but, the world is changing right now. I like to call, there's a good, the question is, how can, any tips? The tip is to, sometimes people are going about their day to day and they don't even remember there's all white guys there. And this is how you guys look. So I like to remind them that I'm sitting in here or I'm looking up, and when I look up, all I see is white guys. And I went to an offsite years ago with my team where I was the HR director for the team. This was a long time ago. And everybody in the team was white, Justin. And I took a picture with me and all of them. And I sent it around to them after I thanked them. And the CEO of the company said, oh my gosh, everybody's white. And I said to him, didn't you not know that? And so I think, people are calling people out right now. And I think if you're in a company, there are ways you can do it, but also our customers and our partners and our clients are also holding company accountable. And so I would approach someone in that company, if you're comfortable with doing that, and said, you know what, you can't walk into a client anymore with an homogeneous group. And I always talk to organization about clients turning people away and not doing business because their group is not diverse. It's real, it's happening. It might not be happening at your company yet, but trust me, it's coming. And so I would point it out. I don't know what you would do, Justin, but I don't have a problem confronting.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I agree with the pointing it out. I've never spoken, and maybe this is just luck, I don't know, but whenever I speak to a CEO, whenever I speak to exec board members about this challenge, I always find it's an open door. And one of the issues they have is they just don't know what to do, and they don't know how to start to address it. So, I would definitely speak out about it, call it out as it is. I'm sure they'll recognize that already. But this situation around the way people hire and using networks and using CV-based, resume-based hiring, I think is really important, because I think that is what's led to what we see in the asset management industry, where you look at fund managers, and I'm a fund manager. In 2017, there was a report saying there were 12 black fund managers in the whole of the city, right, out of thousands. So I do think, looking at resume-based hiring is something which is outdated. And I think in terms of thinking about solutions, including EQ into the hiring process, I think is really important. But also the second thing I think is really important is we always talk about the best person for the job. Oh, the best person is, you have to hire the best person for the job. Actually, let's start thinking about hiring the best person for the team. Let's think about hiring the best person in the group. And I think once you start to have that kind of conversation, then you can look to find solutions to which looks like quite a steep challenge.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Justin. Some really practical, very helpful tips there. I'd like just to ask one final question, if that's okay with you both, from Kate. The conversation about ethnicity and gender has been interesting, challenging, and inspiring. How can we open that up to include social economic background and disabilities? These can be can also majorly impact life chances.
So when I started out, I think I touched on all of the dimensions of diversity, and I spoke of the fact that when I go into organization as a diversity practitioner, I believe that it's important to highlight all of the dimension. And because we are on a global conference today, disability, I think I mentioned that earlier, and gender is one that transcends the globe. Anywhere you go in the world, disability can be applied. I did a lot of work with disability in India. And so I think you really have to look at the stats and really bring it to the forefront to bear. So I know if you're in London, there's a lot that we talk about. For us in the US, we're dealing a lot right now with race, and rightfully so. But I think it's important to bring up the other dimension that is not spoken about a lot, and that's disability. Studies have shown that people with disability, both visible and invisible, are some of the most educated people, Johanna, and underemployed. Mm-hmm. I didn't make that up, it's out there. They have all different types of well-recognized degree and no jobs. And so there's a lot of ways that, especially with COVID around the world, that we can tap into this talent pool and really utilize some of the brilliant skills that are out there with our disabled colleague. And I would encourage you to do so.
The data is frightening.
It is
really frightening, and as you say, Jackie, it's global. The unemployment rates for those with visible and non-visible disabilities is really frightening, and I agree with those points you made there, Jackie. Justin, anything to add around social mobility?
Yeah, no, I do actually. So I think one of the things what we tried to do within LGIM, so I chair the different employee resource groups at LGIM, and we've tried to create a very similar model to the diversity project. Why? Because if you do have a disability employee resource group and a social mobility resource group, you do try to get that kind of cross-fertilization in intersectionality. That is the idea. And I think that's working reasonably well. But I don't think you can fully address ethnicity without actually thinking about social mobility and social economics anyway. So I think that's one of the kinks in the hose pipe that we talk about, that stops the talent from flowing through. And it's right at the start, right? If you come from a less affluent area, the chances of you succeeding is a lot less. And we know that if you look at overall ethnicity, there's a higher proportion of ethnic minorities that come from those less affluent areas. So I think really to unkink that community and pipeline hose pipe, you need to have some focus on social mobility if you really want to fully address ethnicity over the long term.
Absolutely, definitely agree with those points. And as you say, Justin, you can't be talking about and looking at ethnicity without looking at social mobility. And I think the other thing is often organisations focus much less on things around social mobility. It's invisible, but also data is not collected. I had a conversation earlier this week entirely on this topic, and that's one of the keys for organisations to be transparent, but starting to collect more data on this, because we just don't have the information as available as well. I'm very conscious of time, and I just want to round up by just extending my thanks to both of you, Jackie and Justin. It's been a really fantastic conversation. I think the audience have got a lot from it. I definitely have, and lots of practical tips and advice on this topic. And I think the focus of intersectionality has to be addressed in any organisation that is looking at their diversity, inclusion and equity strategies. So thank you again.